The story begins here, in the Dordogne in southern France. 20,000 years ago, it all looked quite different. Covered in ice and snow, the haunt of woolly mammoths and reindeer, which were hunted by our small, hairy ancestors. Primitive? Yes. But here, somewhere underneath my feet, is the proof that they were like us in all the ways that really matter. With only their flickering lamps to guide them, the cavemen felt their way down into the earth. When the prehistoric artists came to Lascaux, the caves were impenetrably dark. These great images were not made to be seen, still less to be sight-seen. Why did they paint them here in the depth of the earth down winding corridors? Some people thought that they were priest painters making hunting magic for the tribe. But the animal the tribe lived on, using every part of it, a kind of walking supermarket, was the reindeer. And they don't paint reindeer. What they paint are the great bulls and bison and the wild deer, all the animals they didn't hunt, but they watched them. Take my favorite image, the great horse, the Mongolian horse. The Mongolian horse doesn't really look like that, with that great sway of the belly and that sharp nose and the inspired black calligraphy of the legs. It's, dare I say it, an impressionistic horse, an impression of a horse, and yet an odd impression. Almost as if the artist was not trying to show what a horse was like, but what it felt to be a horse. Or look at the great bison. These two great black balls of male erotic fury going to explode on one another. He's looked, the artist. He's seen that one of them is losing his coat because it's spring, the rutting season. Observation, and yet emotionally, how right. That great red streak shows something of the feeling of the animal. And it's this looking with awe and with wonder that makes Lascaux what it is. Because all these animals are beautiful. And centuries ago, when there was room on earth for all of us, how humankind must have yearned to be strong and beautiful, free, innocent, all the things that they were not and we are not. And perhaps that's why they made these images secretly in the earth, to honor the animals. And so you see, scientifically, these are primitive people, because science advances. It's like a ladder, one step leads to another. But art isn't like that. Art is about being human. Children make art instinctively. Archaeologists know when they find evidence of art, they found evidence of human beings. It expresses all that is best in us, our desires, our hopes, our truth. And so art changes, but it doesn't get better. And in the great hall of the bulls, with these images of majesty and power, so strong, so dignified, we understand that painting starts at the top. And after the caves, a blank. 15,000 years go by, and then the story starts again in ancient Egypt. In the world of the pharaohs, the Tutankhamun world, human creation was on an epic scale. But though we know the names of the rulers, we know practically nothing about the architects, sculptors and painters. They were merely functional, as you can see from the name for both sculptor and painter, he who keeps alive. Essentially, the art of ancient Egypt springs from their intense belief in the afterlife. Originally, all these temples were covered in brightly coloured paint. But the harsh outside world erodes, burns, bleaches out. It's only in the sealed-away places, like the tombs, where paintings have survived. This is a painting we were never supposed to see. It was a purely private matter between Ramoses, the governor of Thebes, and an artist whose name we'll never know, but whose skill would enable Ramoses to do what he couldn't do himself, that is, have a highly successful afterlife. Because the Egyptians believed that what you had in the tomb went with you. It made all the difference between great success in the afterlife and miserable anonymity. Now, Ramoses clearly had a most impressive funeral, but it was no good just having it once. He wanted it always, always there with him to show in the afterlife what a great, important figure he was. This is my favourite bit, the mourning women. And of course, you don't want real grief with you in the afterlife, and that's not what he's getting. He's got highly professional mourners, very expensive. If you look at those faces lifted upwards, they're completely impassive. And they're doing the whole mourning act with enormous grace, their arms like a great sea anemone stretching out with elegance into all directions. And the artist has clearly put in this little naked slave girl to show the difference between her and the real mourners. And there's a beginner mourner too, holding on to the elderly lady to show how these movements of the hands have to be learnt. And you know she's the senior lady because she has this drooping pear of a breast as opposed to the firm little apples of everybody else. So there it is. Rich, successful, important governor Ramoses. And what a joy that at long last we're able to share with him his elegant ladies. Whatever the subject, Egyptian tomb painting obeys the same rigid rules. They want the messages to the next world to be totally clear. What one nobleman wanted was an eternity hunting on the Nile. Can you see? Each part of the human body is seen from the most readable angle. A profile is clearer than full face, but the eyes are clearer seen from the front. Full front torso, sideways legs. And it's Nibberman's too, so he's enormous, with a small wife and a tiny daughter. Then what energy in the hunting cat and the birds. The Egyptian artist felt free, plainly, to paint birds with enormous vitality. He hadn't got to make it as clear as he had with the human figure. But if we want an art which takes the human body seriously, we have to wait for the rise of a neighbouring civilization. Here, as we can see from the Parthenon statues, it's the human body really looked at that's the centre of the artist's interest. Greek writers tell us their wall painting was equally good, unstinting in their praise for its skill and realism. But walls get destroyed, and now the only Greek painting left is on vases. This is a masterpiece, painted and potted by a man called Exikias. At first sight, you might think the figures look disappointingly flat. But look closer, and you're drawn into an intense human struggle. You can see what the main story is, a man-woman conflict. But for the Greeks, it was much more than that. This is the story of the famous Achilles, the greatest of the heroes, a killing machine. And the woman is Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, that Greek horror story of the race of fighting women, aggressive women. And what is she? A vulnerable young girl. They're so different. The man is a great black menace. He even looks masked. We see that he's a man, but we can't see his face. And the woman is all white and soft. We see her face all right, with its clear skin, her black curls. She's so lightly armoured, and he crushes her. And the story says that as Achilles killed her, as he drove his spear through her throat, their eyes met. And he saw how young she was and how lovely and how brave, and he fell in love. But he'd killed her. And of course, in killing her, he'd killed perhaps his own future happiness. And this is on a vase. Think what the wall painting must have been like. AD, Vesuvius erupts, burying the Roman town of Pompeii. This is one of those instances when something happened that for those concerned was a tragedy, because they died, choking in the volcanic ash, struggling to breathe, and that's a terrible way to die. But although we may say alas and alack, for us, selfishly, it turned out a great piece of good fortune, because the dry volcanic ash that buried Pompeii preserved a Roman city almost in its entirety. Of course, it's wonderful that we have Pompeii, and I don't want to sound ungrateful, but it was only a small provincial town, and we can't really expect great art here. Like the Greeks, the Romans were also interested in realism, but they can't always quite carry it off. These figures are rather unconvincing. Here, however, is a portrait of an unknown couple which really shows Pompeii's art at its best. Fortunately, the Romans had a great interest in faces, and some unknown painter came here and he painted this exceptional portrait. What we do know is that these two were married. There's just an indefinable something about them. But not all that long married, wouldn't you think? I've sometimes wondered if this isn't an expensive version of the wedding photograph. That gawky young man with his big ears. I don't think he's grown into his face yet. He has these beautiful sensual lips but that anxious forehead, and he's looking at us so apprehensively, clutching that precious scroll to his bosom. And then his elegant wife, who I think will drive the family car. She's gazing pensively into the distance with her pen at her delicately pointed chin. And that direction of the gaze, hers to the distance, his apprehensively out at us, just suggests so subtly that this is a marriage that hasn't yet come together. And because this house was still being built when the volcano erupted, the odds are it never had time to come together. They move us and interest us, and that's what makes a good portrait. And it's still more moving when we remember that for hundreds and hundreds of years we won't see something like this again. People looking at us from a wall with such dignity and vitality and intimacy. But a strange new sect, the Christians, was soon to conquer the Roman Empire and change the story of painting. In the East, there was a great reaction against the power of the image, the icon. They began to fear that pictures were idols, graven images. And so, icon painting became safeguarded and highly regimented. Icon painting has barely changed for 1,000 years. Here in the West, we went through the Dark Ages, where the rules and law of the Roman Empire were a distant memory. Christian communities like the monks on the remote Isle of Iona lived in real fear of Viking raids. But here they were also free to use their Celtic traditions to create the greatest work of art ever to come from the British Isles, the Book of Kells. If I say this is a book to die for, people probably did die for it. Hiding it, finally escaping with it. One can imagine a little boat, a coracle, and some monk sitting there with the Book of Kells clasped to his breast, one of the few survivors who had to live to take the precious book back to the Irish mainland. And even there it wasn't safe, because about 200 years later, somebody stole the book. Not, alas, for the book itself, because it was probably an illiterate thief, but for the wonderful binding and the casket it was in. And then the wretched villain threw the book into a bog where it stayed for some months until, happily, it was found. And then Cromwell's men came and it was sent to Dublin to be safe. And then the worst came, because a well-meaning restorer thought the book might look better if it was slightly smaller and cut bits off. Here you can see this extraordinary page of St. John. The damage shows in the tragedy that this is a surreal St. John, because round the corners are sticking parts of another body, hands and feet, and up at the top, cut off by that restorer, a dastardly creature whose name I will not reveal to you, the head that would have told us who this body is. Is it God the Father embracing St. John? Embracing the world? Or was this a sort of crucifixion? Is this Christ on the cross and St. John, as it were, makes the cross in the middle? Or is it neither of those? Is it just Celtic imagination run wild? We don't know, because it's been destroyed. And things are written in the book, business transactions of the monastery, and people signed their names. It's one of the miracles that something so wonderful and precious has survived. Turrets, battlements, a castle. We've come to the Middle Ages and the time of chivalry. Now the world is becoming smaller. Artists are travelling around and meeting one another. And we're beginning to have what's called, rather pompously, an international style. Rich Hours of the Duke of Berry, a suitably luxurious title for the sunniest Middle Ages ever painted. Gentry play, happy peasants toil. It's the rich man's view, and that's what the Duke of Berry was. After 1,000 years, non-religious themes in art have reappeared, and the Limburg brothers paint the Duke's property, castles, land and peasants to liven up his prayer book. The only castle painted by the Limburgs which survives today is Samur in the Loire Valley. What do we see when we look at this enchanting picture? Well, what the Duke of Berry saw was a page from the most splendid manuscript ever owned by a royal prince. And one can imagine him in a broad iron church looking at these magnificent pictures. This is the month of August from the calendar at the beginning of the book. And it's a miraculous picture because it gives the Duke just what he wants. There's the castle, one of his 17 castles, all pearly and gleaming in the light. And here are the courtiers on their splendid horses, perhaps the Duke himself on that white horse, out hawking in all the glory of their attire. But because the Limburgs are great artists, they don't just give the Duke what he wants. They give what they actually saw. And they saw those fields and the river and the peasants swimming, mother naked, unembarrassed, frolicking in the water. So in the front, the courtiers, those living, apparently, the good life. This is August, remember, very hot. They're clothed to the neck in rich, tight clothes. I mean, look at the women's waists. They're on these horses following a game, right, hawking, but it's the rules of the game. And even those sort of canoodling in the back, there are rules for exchanging love looks. So it's a very constricted life, a life being looked at, whereas the peasants, they're free. They're happy. Which is better off, the Limburgs might have been asking. Now, it's this double level that I find so marvellous, and all the Limburgs do. And my favourite painting, I think, is this one, February. Because at first you just see it's comic. Here is the lady of the house, the peasant lady, warming her underpants before the fire, modestly averting her gaze from the men of the house, who are warming their lack of underpants before the fire. And it's this ability truly to look without fixed ideas of what is fitting that makes great painting. The Middle Ages was actually a dreadful time of war and disease. Plague probably killed the Limburgs and the Duke of Berry, while in England the first poll tax caused a peasant rebellion. King Richard II survived this, only to be deposed and imprisoned. The Wilton diptych, today guarded by the National Gallery, was painted for him by a forgotten artist, perhaps his last comfort in that dark dungeon. At first sight, it's perfectly conventional. But when you take a second look, you realize that everybody in this picture is either pointing towards or looking at the least significant figure, young King Richard II, except for rather that dim angel at the back that hasn't sort of quite got the idea. And the idea is a political idea. Because Richard was a disastrous king, poor lamb. He was handsome and brave, but he never kind of made it. He hadn't the charism that makes a leader. And all his life he had to struggle against the rejection by his people. For one thing, he didn't want to fight the French, which greatly upset the English. And at the end, shortly after this was painted, he was deposed and died in suspicious circumstances. So you can see what he wants here. He wants to convince himself, and this became the kind of linchpin of his kingship, that it didn't matter what people thought. All that mattered was what heaven thought. You couldn't unking a king. You were born such. And he's showing all the powers of heaven are on his side. There's even that rather vulgar touch, that the angels are actually wearing his badge of the White Hart. If you think of them as wearing little Union Jacks, you'll see how really very low class that is, but it comforted him. And you can imagine poor Richard, rejected and depressed, propping this icon up as he knelt to say his prayers, and remembering that even if his people didn't love him, the powers of heaven did. In the story so far, we've spanned centuries and continents. But in the next program, our story becomes focused through one man. His name is Giotto.